Story 1. Welcome, sleepy soul. I'm your storyteller for this evening, here to assist you in drifting off into a deep and peaceful sleep. Before we start, please remember to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime stories. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what the time is there, and if there's a particular story you'd like to hear next. I'd be happy to know that, too. I had just turned 17 when I got my first real job. Before that, I'd done some babysitting, helped my uncle at his garage on a few weekends, and worked the concession stand during my high school's football games. But this was different. It was the first job where I had to complete tax paperwork, wear a specific uniform, and punch a time clock. The place was called Haven's Bread and Deli, a small family-owned bakery nestled into the corner of a shopping plaza in my hometown of Greystone, Ohio. The work wasn't glamorous, but it felt like a very big deal to me back then. They were famous for their sourdough breads, cinnamon rolls, and a line of subs that always brought in the lunch crowd. For me, it meant a steady paycheck, a little independence, and a chance to save some money for community college. My mom was thrilled I'd found something local. My dad was mostly worried that I'd be able to keep a balance between school and work. I promised him I would. When I first started, there were fewer than 15 employees, split across morning, afternoon, and evening shifts. Such a small number meant everyone got to know each other pretty fast. Some people were full-time bakers, a few were cashiers like me, and then there was the delivery driver, Mark Ellison. Mark was in his early 50s, though he looked older. He had gray streaks in his beard, sun-spotted skin, and a permanent hunch. In his posture from years of carrying heavy boxes, from the very first day, he gave me a kind of attention that made my stomach twist into knots. At first, I tried to just brush it off. I thought maybe he was just being friendly. Maybe I was being overly cautious. But even then, deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I remember my very first shift. I was standing nervously behind the counter, fumbling with the register, when Mark walked in through the back door. He carried 2 empty bread crates under one arm, his shirt stained with flour and sweat. Well, he said, his eyes locking onto me immediately. We got ourselves a new face here. Yeah. First day, I replied, trying to force a smile. He set the crates down and stepped closer. Then he needed to, resting his elbows on the counter. Name, Eiley, I told him. Pretty name, he said without any hesitation, his lips curling into a grin that didn't feel quite friendly. I'm Mark, the delivery guy. I'll be around. You'll be seeing a lot of me. I just nodded, wishing he would please just back up a little. That day on, every single time he saw me, he acted like I was the most fascinating person in the entire room. He would linger long after other people had come and gone. He cracked jokes that only I was meant to hear. He asked far too many questions, personal ones. You got a boyfriend, Emily? What do you do after work, huh? I bet you go to parties. You seemed like a music kind of girl. What bands are you into? I kept my answers short and polite. The truth was, I didn't have much of a social life outside of school and work. My circle of friends was small, and most of them were busy planning for universities while I was just trying to keep my head above water. Still, I didn't want to give Mark anything more than I absolutely had to. Something about his gaze lingered for too long, like he was memorizing details he had no business knowing. Mark wasn't a lazy worker. In fact, he was the complete opposite. He showed up early, loaded and unloaded all the deliveries by himself, and took extra shifts without ever complaining. The bosses, 2 sisters named Marianne and Carol, loved him for that. Whenever someone mentioned his odd behavior, they would just shrug it off. Oh, that's just Mark, they'd say. He's harmless. But harmless was not the word I would have used. It was little things. At first, when I was mixing Rice Krispie treats in the back, he'd wander over and ask if he could lick the bowl like a little kid. When I went to grab ingredients off a high rack, he'd suddenly be standing right in front of it, forcing me to squeeze past him. His arm would brush against mine, and I'd pretend not to notice the smirk on his face. If I tried to avoid him, he'd find some excuse to hang around until I came back. He wasn't ever overtly aggressive. He knew exactly how to disguise it. To anyone else watching, it just looked like he was chatty, maybe a little bit eccentric. But to me it felt like a constant pressure always pressing in, and it never let up. The first real red flag came about 2 months in. I was stocking the pastry case when Mark walked in holding an envelope. "Got something for you," he said. I glanced around nervously, hoping another employee was nearby. Nobody was. "What is it?" I asked. He slid the envelope across the counter. Inside were 2 tickets to see a band I loved, Silverlight, and they weren't just regular tickets either. They were for the front row. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to go so badly, but I also knew this was completely wrong. Thanks, but I can't," I said quickly. "Why not?" he asked, his face darkening just a little. "I'm not allowed to go with, coworkers," I lied. Mark leaned in closer. "You don't even got to tell anyone, just you and me. I'll drive, I'll get you home safe, it'll be fun." I shook my head firmly. "No, I'm sorry." His smile froze for just a second before he forced it back onto his face. "Alright, suit yourself. Guess I'll find someone else." But I could tell by the look in his eyes that he wasn't going to let this drop. On my 18th birthday, he upped the ante. He brought in a wrapped package and handed it to me while everyone else was in the middle of a big lunch rush. "Open it later," he whispered. When I got home, I tore off the paper and felt my skin instantly crawl. It was a t-shirt, 2 sizes, too small, clearly chosen that way on purpose. Tucked inside was a note in sloppy handwriting. It read, "Put it on and send me a pic. Bet you'll look amazing." At the bottom was his personal phone number. I threw the whole thing in the trash. Immediately, my hands shaking. The next day, he asked me if I got his gift. "Yeah, thanks," I said, forcing my tone to stay completely neutral. "You try it on." "No, you should text me when you do." "I don't have your number," I lied. "I gave it to you," he pressed. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "I don't have it anymore." He stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment, his jaw tightening. Then, just like that, he forced a laugh. All right, no worries." But after that, his fake friendliness took on a much sharper, colder edge. Mark's persistence grew bolder. He'd ask me for hugs on his birthday. He'd stand far too close to me in the tiny break room once. He even lifted his shirt to show me a scar on his stomach, holding it up for far longer than was necessary while I tried my best not to look. I gathered my courage and complained to Marianne just once. "He's making me uncomfortable," I admitted, my voice low. She just chuckled. "That's just Mark being Mark. He's harmless. Don't take it so seriously." But it wasn't harmless. It felt dangerous. One night as I was leaving, he caught me alone in the parking lot. "You really should let me take you out sometime," he said. I gripped my car keys tight between my fingers, my throat going dry. "I'm not interested, Mark. You don't got to be nervous. I'd treat you right." I opened my car door without replying, shut it hard, and drove away. For the rest of that night, I couldn't shake the horrible feeling that he might be following me. Months passed. I got a little better at avoiding him, though it was utterly exhausting. Sometimes I seriously considered quitting, but I desperately needed the money. Then one morning I walked in and saw that his name had been scratched right off the schedule. Carol called me into the office. "Emily, I need to let you know Mark won't be working here anymore." I tried to act neutral, but inside I felt a massive wave of relief. "What happened?" I asked. Her face was very serious. "We found out he wasn't honest with us. He has a criminal history. He never disclosed any of it. Someone tipped us off, and when we checked it was bad." My stomach dropped. "What kind of history?" She hesitated before saying, "He's a registered sex offender, convicted in the 90s for kidnapping a minor. There were other charges too. We had no idea. We never ran a background check." I couldn't breathe for a moment. All those tickets, the shirt, the creepy comments, the way he always lingered. Suddenly, every memory sharpened into something far more sinister and dangerous. "Is he gone?" I asked. "We terminated him, but he didn't take it well at all. When he showed up after being fired, he had a weapon on him. We had to call the police. They took him away in handcuffs." My knees felt weak. If I had ever said yes to one of his invitations, if I had gone to just one concert, what would have happened to me? I kept working at Havens for another year, but the atmosphere was never the same again. Every single time the bell above the door jingled, my chest would tighten, half expecting to see Mark walk back in again. I started carrying pepper spray. I memorized the license plates of every car in the parking lot. Even now, years later, I think about him sometimes. Not because I miss him not even close, but because I realize how terribly close I came to being a tragic headline. One small decision, one yes instead of a no, could have changed everything forever. I never did see him again after that day. I don't ever want to. But every time I drive past that old plaza, I can still feel the heavy weight of his stare. And I know in my gut that if he had ever gotten the chance, he would have taken everything from me. Story 2. I was 17 when I got my first job at a fast food place named Burger Barn. It wasn't glamorous work, not even close, but at that age, all I really cared about was having a paycheck of my own. My parents were always stretched pretty thin financially, and I hated having to keep asking them for money whenever I wanted to hang out with my friends or buy new clothes. The job could be stressful sometimes, especially during the dinner rush, when the line seemed endless and the fryers hissed non-stop. But there was also something oddly comforting about the routine. My Burger Barn was in Riverton, a small town just outside of Madison. It was situated in a plaza across from a 24-hour gas station and a pawn shop. The building always smelled faintly of grease, even before you stepped inside. The uniform was a pair of stiff black pants, a red polo shirt with the logo stitched over the chest, and a visor that never stayed comfortable on my head. Still, it represented independence. During my first couple of weeks, I kept mostly to myself. I was quiet, focused entirely on memorizing the register system and trying my hardest not to mess up any orders. But eventually, I started warming up to some of the other employees. Most of them were either in high school like me or in their early 20s. Some were college dropouts, others were just working there until something better came along. That's when I met Dylan. Dylan was 20, maybe 21. He wasn't particularly tall, but he carried himself like he was. With his shoulders squared, his presence was somehow louder than his actual voice. He had a sharp jawline, tattoos crawling up both of his forearms, and dark hair that was always just a little too long for food service standards. The first time we really talked was when he slid into the break room while I was eating chips from the vending machine. "You're new, right, Teresa?" he asked, leaning against the wall like he owned the whole place. "Yeah," I said, brushing crumbs off my lap. "Couple weeks," he smirked. "Don't worry, you'll hate it soon enough." Something about the way he said it made me laugh, and from that moment on, we talked more often. He had this unique way of turning boring shifts into something else, like when he made sarcastic commentary about customers under his breath, or when he could recite entire scenes from horror movies word for word. He was funny in a very dark way, the kind of humor that made people either laugh uncomfortably or just walk away. I wasn't used to someone like him paying much attention to me. At school, I wasn't exactly invisible, but I wasn't the girl anyone went out of their way to notice either. Dylan did notice me, and at the time, that meant something. Before long, we started hanging out together outside of work. Since I was only 17, he couldn't take me to bars, so most nights, we'd just drive around in his beat-up Honda, smoking cigarettes with the windows rolled down, or we'd sit in his small apartment playing video games and talking about everything from music to family to death. His apartment was a small one-bedroom with peeling linoleum floors and a permanent smell of old smoke, but to me, it felt like freedom compared to my parents' house. At first, Dylan seemed like just another guy with a rough childhood who covered it all up with jokes. But the more time I spent with him, the more cracks I began to notice. Sometimes his jokes weren't really jokes at all. One night, after a particularly long Saturday shift, we sat on his couch with the TV playing some late-night infomercial in the background. Dylan leaned back, exhaling a cloud of smoke, and said very casually, "You ever think about how easy it would be to kill someone and not get caught?" I froze mid-sip of my soda, waiting for the punchline. He glanced at me with a half-smile. "I mean, it's all about opportunity," he continued, as though he was simply describing how to fix a flat tire. "No cameras, no witnesses, just quick and clean." I laughed nervously. "Okay, Dexter, chill out." He just grinned wider. "What?" "I'm serious. It really unsettled me. But I told myself it was just his sense of humor. Dark, twisted, but ultimately harmless. I even laughed along with him because, well, wasn't I just as guilty? I made dead baby jokes, zombie apocalypse jokes, things that would have made my mum clutch her pearls if she ever heard me. Who was I to judge him? Still, something about the look in Dylan's eyes stuck with me. He wasn't laughing the way he usually did. He looked almost excited. Over the next few months, there were other red flags. The way he talked about people he didn't like, customers, managers, even other co-workers, wasn't just simple annoyance. He would describe hurting them in disturbingly detailed ways. Once, after a customer yelled at him over some cold fries, he whispered to me, "Some people just don't deserve to breathe." He laughed when he said it, but the sharp edge in his voice wasn't funny at all. And then there was his temper. I never saw him actually hit anyone, but I saw the way his fists would clench, the way his jaw would twitch. He punched walls in the break room, leaving little dents behind. I told myself it wasn't my problem. He wasn't like that with me. He treated me like his closest friend. But the truth was, I didn't really know him at all. The night everything changed. Started like any other. It was a Thursday evening in late fall, chilly enough that our breath puffed out in little clouds as we walked. After our shift ended, Dylan suggested we hit up a bar he liked on the edge of town. "I can't. I'm not 21 yet," I reminded him. "Doesn't matter," he said, with that cocky grin of his. "I know the guy at the door. He owes me a favor." I hesitated, but the idea of going somewhere new, somewhere that felt grown-up, was too tempting. I agreed. The bar was a dive called the Rusty Nail. Dim lights, sticky floors, a jukebox in the corner playing rock music from the 90s. Dylan's friends were already there, a group of scruffy guys in their mid-20s who greeted me like I belonged, immediately shoving a beer into my hand. Nobody seemed to care about my age at first. It was actually fun. We joked, we laughed, we drank just enough to feel a little lightheaded. But when his friends left, the whole atmosphere shifted. Dylan leaned closer across the sticky table, his voice lower, his eyes intense. "You know, sometimes I just want to do it." "Like really do it?" I asked, though I felt like I already knew. "Kill somebody." I laughed weakly. "You're drunk." He shook his head, his grin widening, but his eyes were deadly serious. "No, I've thought about it. I know exactly how I'd do it, who I'd pick. It'd be so easy." A chill ran straight through me. "Dylan, stop. That's not funny. I'm not kidding." His tone sharpened. "One day, you'll see." I wanted to leave right then, but I didn't want to cause a scene. So, I just laughed it off, changed the subject. And soon after we left the bar, walking down Riverton's empty streets, I kept replaying his words in my head. He pointed at a man waiting alone at a bus stop. "See that guy?" Dylan whispered. "Wouldn't even fight back. One stab. That's all it'd take." "Shut up," I snapped. He just smirked and said nothing more. We walked in silence until another man passed us, going the opposite direction. He was maybe in his 30s, wearing thin glasses, dressed like he worked a regular office job. Dylan deliberately bumped into him, hard, shoulder against shoulder. "Watch it," the man muttered. "What did you say?" Dylan's voice dropped. Suddenly, dangerous. The man tried to step aside, but Dylan shoved him back. I rushed forward. "Dylan, stop." He didn't mean anything, but Dylan's face twisted, and in one swift motion he pulled a knife from his pocket. "Dylan," I screamed. The man froze, his eyes wide with fear, and then, faster than I could even process, he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a handgun. The crack of the single shot echoed down the empty street. Dylan staggered, clutching his side, before collapsing onto the pavement. My breath caught in my throat. The man stood there shaking, the gun still pointed, his face pale. He didn't look like some thug. He looked absolutely terrified. I fumbled for my phone and called 911, my voice trembling as I told them what had happened. The man didn't run. He just stood there trembling, muttering, "He had a knife. He had a knife." Asterisk within minutes. Sirens wailed and the street filled with flashing red and blue lights. Officers surrounded us. Medics rushed over and loaded Dylan onto a stretcher. He was still conscious, groaning in pain, blood soaking through his shirt. I told the police everything. I didn't sugarcoat a thing. Dylan had started the fight. Dylan had pulled the knife first. I wasn't going to lie for him. They let the man go. It was clearly self-defense. Dylan survived, but he never forgave me. He texted me once from the hospital, "You betrayed me." I blocked his number immediately. I never saw him again. Looking back, I should have known. The signs were always there, hiding behind his smirk and his dark jokes. I just didn't want to see them. And now, sometimes when I walk alone at night, I think about the way Dylan looked at me across that bar table, his eyes alight with something dark, whispering, "One day you'll see." I wonder what would have happened if that man hadn't been armed. I wonder if I'd even be here now to tell this story. Story 3. I never thought that working the night shift at a hospital would change my life the way it ultimately did. When I first applied for the job, I just needed something steady. I was 26, had recently moved to Springfield, Ohio after a difficult breakup, and I didn't have much money saved up. My cousin, who worked as a nurse at Memorial General, told me the front desk needed night shift clerks. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was work, and work meant stability. I told myself I'd do it for a year, maybe 2, while I figured out what I really wanted to do with my life. The first few months actually weren't so bad. Nights in a hospital can be very unpredictable, but they're not like the chaotic scenes you see on television dramas. Some nights were almost dead quiet, just a handful of patients checking in or tired family members nodding off in the waiting room chairs. Other nights it felt like every ambulance in the entire county was rolling up at once. The worst part of the job wasn't the blood or the occasional outbursts from drunk patients. The hardest part was the silence. Those long, empty stretches between 2 and 3 a.m. when the world outside felt completely empty and you sat alone, under harsh fluorescent lights with nothing but the low hum of the vending machines and the occasional cough echoing down the hallway. That was when I really got to know my coworker, Nathan. Nathan was about my age, maybe a year or so older, skinny build, and he always wore a hoodie no matter what the weather was like. He'd been working there a year longer than I had, so he knew all the ropes. At first, he was pretty easy to talk to. We'd pass the time chatting about movies, or he'd tell me stories about some of the weirdest patients he'd ever seen. But about a month into my job, he asked me out. It wasn't anything dramatic, just one night when the waiting room was completely empty. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Hey, after shift sometime, you want to grab breakfast? There's this diner on Main that's pretty good." I remember hesitating, and then forcing a polite smile. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't really mix work with that kind of stuff." He nodded quickly, almost too quickly. Yeah, no worries. Just figured I'd ask." I thought that would be the end of it, but the air between us changed after that. He wasn't outright hostile. He didn't glare at me or say anything nasty, but the little things started quietly piling up. He stopped joking with me. He'd answer my questions in the shortest way possible. Sometimes I'd walk into the break room and he'd immediately stop talking to whoever was in there. It wasn't enough to formally complain about Not enough to quit over, but it made those long nights feel much heavier. That night, what I now think of as the night, started off slow. It was a Wednesday in February, and Springfield winters were the kind that cut right through your jacket no matter how tight you zipped it up. The parking lot had frozen patches where the snow never seemed to fully melt. I remember blowing into my hands as I walked in, wishing I'd worn a thicker pair of gloves. Inside, the waiting room had only 3 people in it: a woman in her 50s flipping through a magazine, a younger man curled up in a chair with his hoodie pulled over his face, and a tired-looking father holding a little boy wrapped in a blanket. The TVs above the front desk were tuned to the local news, the volume turned down low. I sat behind the counter, sipping the watery coffee from the break room. Nathan was already there, logged into his computer. He barely looked up when I sat down. "Hey," I said. "Hey," he muttered, his eyes glued to the screen. We worked in silence for a while. Around 2 a.m. Nathan stood up, stretched, and said, "Going to take my break?" "All right," I said, clicking through some digital check-in forms. Our breaks were 30 minutes long and staggered, so one of us was always at the desk. I didn't think much of it. I organized some files, wiped down the counter, and then went to grab another coffee from the machine. A few patients trickled in, a man complaining of chest pain, a woman who thought she'd sprained her ankle. Routine stuff. I glanced at the security monitors, like I always did when the desk was quiet. The cameras showed the hallways, the ER entrance, and parts of the parking lot. Everything looked perfectly normal. Nathan returned almost exactly on time. He sat down without saying a single word. His hoodie was zipped all the way up, his hands shoved deep into the pockets. The rest of the shift dragged by UNEVENTFULLY. At 7 a.m. I clocked out, grabbed my bag, and braced myself for the freezing air outside. Nathan had left at 4 a.m. He always took off early if the patient load was light. The employee parking lot was at the far end of the building, away from the main entrance. Hospital policy was to leave the closer spots for patients and visitors. The lot was quiet. Dim yellow lights buzzed overhead, casting long, strange shadows on the icy pavement. As I walked to my car, my stomach tightened. It was the exact same path I always took, the same empty lot, but something felt off, like I wasn't alone. I tried to brush the feeling off, pulled my jacket tighter around myself, and quickened my pace. By the time I slid into my car and locked the doors, my hands were trembling. "Get it together," I muttered to myself, starting the engine. The drive home was only 15 minutes, but it felt much longer. Every red light had me glancing nervously into the rearview mirror. The streets behind me stayed empty, but the unease clung to me like a dark shadow. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the neighborhood was still dark and quiet. My porch light flickered faintly. I stepped out of the car, my bag slung over my shoulder. That was when I noticed the lock on my front door. It wasn't broken, but it wasn't right either. It wiggled when I slid my key in, like it had been tampered with. My pulse began to hammer in my chest. I stood there for a full minute, debating whether or not I should even go inside. Finally, I forced myself to open the door and step in. The house looked normal. My laptop was still on the kitchen table. The TV was right where I'd left it. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed. Nothing. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid, but sleep didn't come easy that day. Every creak of the house had me sitting straight up in bed, straining to listen. When I finally dragged myself out of bed later that morning, the first thing I saw made my stomach drop. Footprints, dirty footprints on my hardwood floor, starting at the front door and trailing into the hallway. They stopped right near my bedroom door. I always took my shoes off at the door. These footprints weren't mine. Asterisk, I called the police immediately. The officer who arrived was calm and professional. He asked all the usual questions. Did anyone else have a key? Was anything missing? Did I have any security cameras? No, I said, but my neighbor does. I don't know if it covers my door, though. He went next door and came back about 15 minutes later. "We've got something," he said. We watched the footage on my neighbor's phone. The quality was grainy, but it was clear enough. A man walked up to my door in the middle of the night, used something small and thin on the lock, let himself in, stayed inside for almost an entire hour, and then walked out again. When he walked out, his hood slipped just enough for me to see his face clearly. It was Nathan. The police arrested him later that day. He'd been in my house, watching me sleep. I quit the hospital a week later. Even with him behind bars, I couldn't shake the horrible feeling of being watched. I couldn't relax in that house ever again. I moved away 3 months later, to a new city and a new job. But even now, years later, I can't park in a dark lot without glancing over my shoulder. I can't hear footsteps behind me without my chest tightening with fear. I keep 3 strong locks on my front door and have cameras on every corner of my property, and on some nights, when the house is completely quiet, I still wake up certain that someone is inside, listening, waiting. Story 4. I was 20 years old when I got a job working late nights at a small family-owned diner in Springfield. It wasn't some shiny, new place. It was an old building tucked between a laundromat and a hardware store, with neon lights that buzzed faintly and a big open sign that stayed lit until midnight. The job wasn't glamorous, but I needed it. I was in college, juggling classes during the day and working nights just to make the rent on a dingy 1-bedroom apartment I shared with a friend. My parents weren't in a position to help me financially, so when my mum's friend, Mr. Peterson, who owned the diner, offered me the night shift job, I said yes without any hesitation. At first I thought it would be easy money. The dining room closed at 9 p.m., which meant after that we only handled takeout orders and deliveries. We kept the place running for night shift workers, truckers, and the occasional late-night straggler. The orders slowed to a trickle after 10, so it was usually very quiet to quiet sometimes. The delivery driver was Mr. Peterson's son, Eric. He was 17, still in high school, and I hadn't known him before that job because he'd spent most of his life living with his mum in another city. From day one, something about him rubbed me the wrong way. He was cocky, always talking about himself, always trying to one-up you no matter what you said. If I mentioned I was tired from a long day of classes, Eric would scoff and say he only needed 4 hours of sleep because his body was built different. If I said I went to the gym, he'd launch into some story about how he used to box but quit because he was too strong and nobody wanted to fight him anymore. He had this way of telling these stories like he genuinely believed every word of them. He'd pace around while talking, sometimes throwing punches in the air, pretending like he was shadowboxing. I found myself tuning him out most nights, just nodding enough so he knew I was technically listening, but inside I really wanted to tell him to just shut up. The truth was, I didn't like him, but I needed the job, so I played along. One slow night in October, the diner was dead. The kitchen smelled faintly of fryer oil, and the hum of the soda machine was louder than our conversation. Eric leaned against the counter, talking about how he'd gotten into a fight at school that week. "Guy came at me," he said, puffing out his chest. "Didn't even think, just dropped him with one punch. Then when he tried to get back up, I kicked him right in the ribs. He stayed down after that." He laughed like it was some highlight reel moment. I forced a smile. "Sounds intense." He tilted his head, studying me. "Do you ever been in a fight?" "No," I admitted. He smirked. "Yeah, you don't seem like the type." Something in the way he said it bothered me, like he was labeling me as weak, as soft, but I let it slide. Most nights followed the exact same pattern. I prepped orders, took phone calls, wiped down counters. Eric either went out on deliveries or paced around the restaurant telling his stories. The nights I dreaded the most were when we had no deliveries. That meant Eric stayed inside, bored and restless, looking for someone to unload his ego onto, and that someone was always me. He'd follow me around, leaning too close sometimes, "No," he said one night. "Most people respect me. They know I can handle myself. Not a lot of guys would dare to mess with me." "Yeah," I muttered, stacking cups. "You don't believe me?" I shrugged. "I believe you." He narrowed his eyes. "You better." One night in late November, things finally boiled over. It was just the two of us. No deliveries, no customers, just silence, broken by Eric's non-stop bragging. He leaned against the counter, spinning a butter knife in his hand. "I got enemies, man. People who hate me, but they won't touch me. They're scared." I was tired. Tired of classes, tired of work, tired of him. So, for once, I let my sarcasm slip. "Yeah, you're a real tough guy, Eric." He froze. His jaw tightened. Slowly, he stepped closer, staring me down. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I said flatly. "Just agreeing with you." But it was too late. He shoved me. I stumbled back, caught completely off guard. But instinct took over, and I shoved him right back, harder. He staggered, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then he swung at me, his fist grazed my cheek. It was more surprising than painful. My heart kicked into overdrive. I reacted without thinking. I smacked him right across the face. He stumbled again, this time clutching his jaw. For a second I thought it was over. I thought maybe he'd back down, but then his face changed. His eyes watered, his lip trembled, not from pain, but from pure rage. And then he grabbed a knife from the counter. It was a chef's knife, sharp and heavy. His hand shook as he pointed it right at me. "You think you're tough?" His voice cracked. "Eric, put it down," I said, backing away, my chest tightening, but he didn't. He lunged at me. I spun around and bolted into the dining area, weaving desperately between tables. He chased me, knife held out, breathing hard, his sneakers squeaking. Against the tile floor, I shoved a chair behind me, trying to slow him down. The clatter echoed loudly through the empty diner. He was right behind me, too close. Then the front door opened. A man in his 40s stepped in, freezing at the sight, me backing away. Eric clutching a knife, panting like a madman. Eric stopped dead. His face went pale. He looked at the knife in his hand, then at the customer, then back at me. The man raised his hands cautiously. Should I call the cops?" Eric's hand trembled. For a moment, I thought he might stab me. Anyway, but then, slowly he dropped the knife. It clattered loudly against the floor. Without saying a single word, he turned and disappeared into the back of the diner. The customer looked at me, concerned. "You okay, kid?" I swallowed hard, trying to catch my breath. "Yeah, I'm fine." "Sure about that?" He glanced warily at the knife on the floor. I shook my head. "It's fine. No cops, please." The man hesitated, then finally nodded. He left, mumbling something about not wanting to get involved. I stood there alone in the empty diner, my hands trembling. The adrenaline drained from me, leaving only exhaustion and dread. I finished my shift in silence, avoiding Eric, who never came back out of the kitchen. When I got home, I sat on the edge of my bed for hours, just staring at the floor. My cheek throbbed where he'd hit me. But what unsettled me the most was the look in his eyes when he held that knife. The next morning, I called Mr. Peterson and quit. I didn't give him a reason, and he didn't ask for one. Maybe he already knew. I never went back. A few years after I'd moved on, I ran into someone who used to work at the diner. I asked cautiously about Eric. They told me he'd dropped out of school, got into trouble, fights, and eventually moved out of state. Nobody seemed to know what happened to him after that. I didn't ask for any details. Some people you just don't want to keep track of. For me, that one night was enough. The look in his eyes, the knife in his hand, that's something I'll never ever forget. And I thank God every single day that the door opened when it did. Because if that customer hadn't walked in, I don't know if I'd be here today to tell this story. Story 5. I was 21 years old back in the summer of 2019. At that time, I worked at a place called Ocean Breeze Car Wash in Volusia County, Florida. I wasn't in college. Truthfully, I wanted to go. but I couldn't afford it, and scholarships never really came my way. Instead, I worked wherever I could find a job, a couple of seasonal retail gigs, but that year I landed at the car wash. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was steady, and I needed the money to cover the rent for my small apartment in Palm Coast. The boss, Rick, was one of those gruff, sunburned, Florida men who always looked half tired and half angry. He wasn't the friendliest person alive, but he wasn't unbearable either. He cared more about the cars coming out spotless than the people scrubbing them. That said, he gave me hours and paid on time, so I tolerated him. Most of my coworkers were decent, too. We were a mix of college kids, high school graduates like me, and a couple of older guys who just needed a reliable paycheck. I got along with almost everyone. Almost. The exception was Aaron Miller, a guy who started working there in January of that year. He was 25, only 4 years older than me, and at first he came across as perfectly normal. He was polite, shook hands firmly, and even cracked some jokes during his first week that made people laugh. I remember thinking, finally, someone I can actually talk to during those long, slow afternoons. For the first month or so, Aaron seemed harmless. He'd ask about my weekend plans, showed a genuine interest in the music I liked, and even suggested I follow him on Instagram. I didn't think twice about it. Everyone at the wash followed each other. It was just part of our little social circle. But around March, the vibe changed. It started small. Aaron brushing past me more often than seemed necessary. He'd put a hand on my shoulder and hold it there a second too long. When I'd hand him towels, his fingers would linger over mine. I laughed it off at first, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid, but soon it became painfully obvious he was doing it all on purpose. One afternoon, while I was refilling the soap solution, he came up behind me and said, "You smell really good. What do you use?" I stepped away quickly and muttered, "Just deodorant." He smirked and said, "Well, whatever it is, it's working." At night, my phone started lighting up with messages from him on Instagram. "We should hang out sometime. Want to grab dinner tonight? You're too cute to be single. You know that." I always answered the same way. "I'm not interested. I just want to keep things professional." But he wouldn't take the hint. By April, I was starting to feel genuinely unsafe at work. I hated being scheduled on the same shift as him, but Rick didn't seem to care when I asked to swap days. I remember pulling Rick aside one afternoon after Aaron had accidentally brushed against my hip. "Rick, I need to talk to you about Aaron," I said quietly. Rick sighed without even looking at me. "What now? He keeps bothering me. He touches me, and he won't stop messaging me outside of work. I'm uncomfortable." Rick finally turned, looking annoyed. "Look, you're an adult. Handle your own problems. I'm not your babysitter." I stood there, completely stunned. "So, you're not going to do anything?" Rick shook his head. "Unless he's screwing up the cars, I don't care. I don't have time for this drama." That was the moment I realized I was completely on my own. My parents weren't much help either. They never really showed much affection growing up, and asking them for advice felt like talking to strangers. My friends were all busy with their own school or work. I didn't want to sound like I was being dramatic, so I kept it all to myself. Meanwhile, Aaron only grew bolder. One evening in May, after my shift, I got home, showered, and threw on a bathrobe. My bedroom window faced the street, and I had stupidly left the blinds halfway open. As I turned my head, I froze. Under the yellow glow of the streetlight, I saw him, Aaron, sitting on a bicycle at the edge of the road, staring directly at my window. My stomach flipped. My throat went completely dry. When his eyes met mine, he immediately pedaled away into the night. I stood there shaking. How the hell did he know where I lived? I had never told him. I had never even mentioned the name of my apartment complex. That night, I blocked him on every platform I could think of, Instagram, Snapchat, even my phone number. I emailed Rick telling him I was quitting because of Aaron's behavior. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. The next morning, my phone had dozens of new Instagram DMs from an account I didn't recognize. The profile picture was blank, but the messages were obvious. Why won't you talk to me? You can't hide forever. I just want to see you. Why are you making this so hard? I knew instantly it was Aaron. I blocked that account. Minutes later, a new one appeared, then another, and then another. By the second day, I had over 20 different accounts messaging me, all with similar creepy lines. He even made new Snapchat usernames. It was relentless. So, I disabled my social media accounts altogether, but it still didn't stop. That Friday night, around 10:30, there was a knock at my front door. I froze. My heart started pounding. I walked quietly to the peephole and looked. It was Aaron. He was standing there in a gray hoodie, shifting from foot to foot, his eyes darting around the porch. I didn't say anything. Then came the knocking again, louder this time. "Open the door," he said, his voice muffled but firm. "We need to talk." I backed away from the door, trembling. He kept pounding. "I'm not leaving. If you don't open this door, we're going to have a problem." That was it. I snapped. I shouted through the closed door, "My dad has a gun. If you don't leave, I'll call the police right now." My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator's calm voice steadied me. "Stay on the line. Officers are on the way. Do not open the door." I stayed crouched on my living room floor, whispering details to the dispatcher. Within 10 minutes, red and blue lights splashed across my windows. Aaron bolted, but the officers arrived in time to catch sight of him biking away. 3 officers came inside. I explained everything, from the workplace harassment to the social media stalking to him showing up at my house. They nodded, their expressions stern. "We'll handle it." That night they found him and warned him to leave me alone. I thought, stupidly, that would finally be the end of it, but the very next morning he was back. This time, the police caught him biking toward my complex. He was arrested on the spot. Later I learned he admitted to horrifying things during his interrogation. He confessed to coming by my apartment multiple times over the past 2 months. He had screenshots of my old photos printed out. He said he just wanted to be close to me. Hearing that shattered me. How many nights had he been outside my window without me knowing? How long had he been planning this obsession? The prosecutor pressed charges, felony stalking and misdemeanor burglary. He could face up to 15 years. It's been years since then, but sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, certain that someone is standing outside my window. I wonder if prison will change him. I wonder if when he gets out he'll remember my face and start all over again. I just hope that I'm wrong. Story 6. I never thought my first real job after college would haunt me the way it still does to this day. I was 24 when I graduated with a degree in finance from the University of Cincinnati. Like most new graduates, I was relieved to finally be done with lectures, exams, and endless group projects. But I was also painfully aware of the debt piling up on my shoulders. I didn't have the luxury of being picky. I applied to every single entry-level finance or accounting position within a 2-hour radius of my apartment. That's how I ended up at Riverbend Logistics, a mid-sized shipping company headquartered just outside Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't glamorous work, and I had never pictured myself buried in spreadsheets about freight costs and cargo insurance. But the pay was steady, the benefits were decent, and the office culture, at least from the outside, seemed pretty relaxed. My first day was intimidating, as all first days are. The building was a squat, beige office park structure tucked between a row of fast food places and a tire shop. Inside, it smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old printer toner. I remember clutching my tote bag a little too tightly as I followed the HR rep through the cubicle maze, trying desperately to memorize names and faces I knew I'd forget within minutes. But even in that overwhelming blur, one man stood out immediately. "Hey there," he said when I was introduced. He extended his hand with a wide grin. "I'm Mark Callahan. Welcome to the circus." He was probably in his late 40s, tall but soft around the middle, with thinning hair he covered with a rotation of novelty baseball caps. That day it was neon orange with the words beer, it's what's for dinner. His desk was cluttered with action, figures and comic books stacked right next to ledgers and invoices, as if he couldn't quite decide whether he worked in an office or a teenager's bedroom. I smiled politely and shook his hand. Nice to meet you. Don't worry, he added, lowering his voice conspiratorially. It's not as bad here as it looks. Just keep your head down, pretend to look busy, and never, ever touch the last donut in the break room. That's blood sport. I laughed awkwardly, unsure if I was supposed to take him seriously, but there was something about him, his easy grin, the way he seemed to shrug off the suffocating monotony of office life that made him seem approachable. At the time, I was grateful. Starting somewhere new is always nerve-wracking, and Mark's friendliness felt like a relief. The first few weeks went smoothly. I was assigned to the finance team under a quiet, detail-oriented supervisor named Julia. My work was mostly data entry and reconciliations. It wasn't exciting, but it paid the bills. Mark wasn't my supervisor, but he was in the same department. He made a point of swinging by my cubicle every single morning. "Morning, rookie," he'd say, holding a steaming styrofoam cup of coffee. "How's life in spreadsheet land?" "Good," I'd answer, sometimes forcing a smile. He'd compliment my outfit, ask how my weekend was, or offer me tips on navigating the office politics. At first, I found it kind of nice. Everyone else in the department was polite but distant, and Mark seemed genuinely interested in making me feel welcome, asterisk. But as weeks turned into months, I started noticing things, small things that on their own seemed harmless. One Monday morning, Mark leaned against the side of my cubicle, sipping his coffee. "Did you have fun at Sharon Woods Park this weekend?" he asked casually. I froze. My roommate and I had gone hiking there on Saturday, but I hadn't posted about it online. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone at work. Yeah, I said cautiously. "How did you know?" he smirked. "Oh, lucky guess. You've got that outdoorsy vibe." Then he winked and walked away. I sat there, feeling unsettled. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he'd overheard me talking to my roommate on the phone. I brushed it off, but the feeling lingered. A few weeks later, I took a phone call during my lunch break outside the building. It was private family stuff I didn't want overheard. That afternoon, Mark strolled up to my desk. "Everything okay with your sister?" he asked softly. My stomach dropped. I hadn't told anyone about that call. He must have been close enough to hear me outside. Again, he framed it as concern, but it felt invasive. I forced a smile. "Yeah, everything's fine." After that, Mark's presence became harder to ignore. He popped up at my desk more often, lingering with weak excuses about needing a stapler or just stretching his legs. One afternoon, as I was typing up a report, he leaned over and said, "I saw you buy that hazelnut roast coffee at Henderson's Market last night. That's my favorite, too." I blinked. Henderson's wasn't near my apartment or the office. I had no idea how he would have known I was there. "Oh yeah," I said awkwardly. He grinned. "Great taste." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach, then came the sticky note. One morning I arrived at my desk to find a yellow sticky note on my keyboard. It read simply, "Have a great day." There was no signature, but I knew it was from Mark. A few days later, I ducked into a small coffee shop 2 blocks from the office, a place I'd never mentioned to anyone. I had just sat down with my latte when the bell over the door jingled and Mark walked in. He spotted me instantly. "Well, look who it is," he grinned, sliding into the chair across from me without asking. "Great minds think alike." "Huh, yeah, I guess so," I murmured. The most unsettling coincidence happened a week later. I was at a Kroger near my apartment, miles from work, just picking up some groceries. As I turned down the cereal aisle, there he was. "Didn't know you shopped here," he said, with a casual wave. I mumbled something about convenience and quickly left the aisle. That night, I couldn't shake the thought. Was he following me? I decided to test a theory. During lunch one day, I mentioned to a coworker that I'd be trying out a new yoga class after work. It was a complete lie. I had no such plans. That evening, around the time the class would have ended, I got a text from an unknown number. Hello. Was yoga. My blood ran cold. I never gave Mark my number. I didn't reply. The next day, Mark strolled by my desk with his usual grin. Morning rookie survived the spreadsheets. I couldn't even look at him. Inside, I was boiling with a mix of fury and fear. The final straw came 2 weeks later. I had stayed late at the office to finish a project. It was nearly 10 p.m. when I finally left, the parking lot nearly empty. Halfway home, I heard someone call my name. I turned and saw Mark stumbling toward me from across the street. His face was flushed, his movements unsteady. He reeked of alcohol. You should give me a chance, he slurred, swaying on his feet. Mark, go home, I said firmly, backing away. He stepped closer, raising his hands as if he were pleading. I'm not a bad guy. You just don't know me yet. My heart raced. I turned and ran, sprinting until I reached a crowded intersection where cars were idled at a red light. I didn't stop until I was surrounded by people. That night, shaking in my apartment, I called the police. They listened, but said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. Unless he threatened me directly or trespassed, their hands were tied. The thought of going back to work made my skin crawl. I called in sick the next morning and immediately began searching for another job. Within a week, I'd given my notice. I never saw Mark again, but to this day, when I walk home at night, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him there, grinning under the glow of a street lamp.